The speculation about Tim Floyd's future with the Chicago Bulls is about to end. In just moments, Bulls brass will reveal if he'll be named the new head coach or play an entirely different role. Good morning, everybody. I'm Larry Potash.
And I'm Bill Weir. It is the offseason, but the United Center is still the place to be this hour. Bulls management about to announce where the former Iowa State coach fits into the game plan.
And WGN's Dan Roan is live at the UC awaiting the big announcement. Hey, Dan.
Hi, Larry and Bill. You know, the Cirque du Soleil has set up shop outside here in the parking lot, and they don't have anything on what's going on around here the last couple of days. We'll find out in just a couple of minutes, not if Tim Floyd has joined the organization here in Chicago. We know that's the case. But in which capacity will he have joined it? As a new layer of administration under Jerry Krause, waiting for another coach, an interim coach, until Tim finally takes over? Or does Floyd become the head coach right now? Got a long, strong coaching pedigree, this guy, 44 years old, played basketball in college at Louisiana Tech, a longtime assistant on under one of the gurus of college basketball, Don Haskins at Texas El Paso, and then as a head coach at the University of New Orleans and at Iowa State, of course, has compiled a very good record, plus 500 everywhere he's been, a solid basketball man, but of course it's so much different to be a coach at this level than it is in college. The entire dynamic of the whole thing has changed. The players run the league in the NBA, and the coaches run the basketball programs, of course, in college. So that's what Tim Floyd faces as a coach. Coming up in a few minutes, Jerry Reinsdorf will be the first speaker today, the Bulls chairman of the board, and then Tim Floyd will follow him up, and I would assume that we'll hear some from Jerry Krause also. So it's going to be a wild scene out here today just to see what finally happens, and I'm sure you guys that by the time this is all said and done today, there will still be plenty of questions left unanswered, and the foremost of which would be whether or not Michael Jordan comes back to play again in 98-99.
You're right, Dan. So many, well, 11 free agents of the 15 who played for the Bulls last year coming up. Their futures seemingly tenuous, depending on what exactly is said here today. What's your gut? You going with the Tribune report that he is director of basketball operations?
Well, I think it's a safe way for the organization to go right now because of the lockout. You know, this thing may not be resolved until sometime in December or January. If that's the case, that buys the Bulls some time to see if Michael Jordan might relent and consider playing for somebody else if it's a short season, if Scottie Pippen comes back, if Rodman returns, and if some of his questions are finally answered before they finally get this season underway. Other scenarios, and I think the one that the Bulls fans would be dreaming about today would be the fact that Tim Floyd could possibly have this operations job, and maybe, against all odds, Phil Jackson would come back and coach these guys for one more season. But Phil has been adamant in saying he won't do that. So that might be the least likely of everything that could happen. The other thing is that Tim Floyd may wind up being the head coach today. We don't know for certain that that won't happen.
Well, as one columnist in the Tribune, it's been an entire chess game for these past few weeks, and you talk about the Bulls fans have been listening to sports radio lately, and everybody talks about the two things: maybe Krause going back to the White Sox, and Jackson coming back. What are your feelings about that?
And leaving Tim Floyd in a position of authority above Phil Jackson, that will never happen. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, that is pretty safe. We do know that it was somewhat of a struggle from what we've heard from Ames for him to uproot his family and move here, especially after the cold shoulders he's somewhat received.
Well, that's a question, Bill, and also the question of, do you want to be known as the guy that helped drive Michael Jordan out of basketball? I think that's a tough thing for anybody to swallow. I guess we're ready to start. Jerry Reinsdorf about to take the podium.
Everybody ready out there?
Let's see if we get some answers to some of these questions.
We'll begin the press conference with a few remarks from Jerry Reinsdorf. He will then in turn introduce Tim Floyd. Tim will have some remarks, and following that, we'll open it up to your questions. Jerry?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I've said over and over again that I wanted to bring back the players and the coach who won the 1998 championship. Now, two things have hampered that desire. First, of course, Phil Jackson has repeatedly said that he does not want to coach next year. And second, the lockout makes it impossible for us to talk to our players about next year. Since we have 9 free agents on this team, we have no idea what the makeup of the team is going to be. It could run all the way from very, very young, to exactly the same team that won the championship. We just have no idea at this point. With Phil's desire to leave, we had no choice but to search for a new coach. Jerry Krause and I engaged in a very thorough interview process, which I personally enjoyed very much. We interviewed a number of extremely bright, capable men with whom we engaged in intense discussions about basketball. It certainly was an education for me to sit down and talk to these people. After completing the process, Jerry Krause and I concluded that there was one person who stood out as the obvious choice, and that person was Tim Floyd. However, we also concluded that nothing should be allowed to stand in the way of our desire to bring back the championship team. We also reminded ourselves that we had told Michael Jordan that he could take as long as he wanted to recover from the grind of last season before deciding whether or not he wanted to play next season. We then called in Tim Floyd for an even more in-depth discussion. During the course of that discussion, Tim reminded us that he previously had said that he did not want the coaching job if Phil Jackson wanted to come back, or if his taking the coaching job would cause Michael Jordan to retire. And that Michael Jordan has often said that he did not want to play for anyone other than Phil Jackson. The three of us concluded that there was an obvious solution, and that is what we are here to announce today. Actually, we have two things to announce. The first thing that I wish to announce is that the position of head coach of the Chicago Bulls is not going to be filled at this time. It will be left open, perhaps until the end of the lockout. During that time, if Phil Jackson changes his mind and decides to return, Michael can have the coach that he and we have always wanted him to have. Having said that, if Phil does not change his mind, we cannot be in the position of trying to have a coach or looking for a coach when the lockout ends. It is likely that there will be only a short interval between the end of the lockout and the opening of training camp. None of the candidates we interviewed would be available at that time. Therefore, we are also announcing that Tim Floyd has agreed to join us as Director of Basketball Operations. In that position, he will be responsible for a variety of tasks, including those that normally would be handled by the head coach during the summer. Should Phil return by the end of the lockout, should Phil not return by the end of the lockout, Tim will succeed him as head coach of the Chicago Bulls. If Phil does return, Tim would continue to serve as Director of Basketball Operations and would be involved in personnel matters, scouting, and basketball business. Also, he would succeed Phil as head coach at whatever time in the future Phil decides to step down. This kind of an arrangement was actually discussed with Phil Jackson and agreed to by Phil Jackson last summer when he signed what he said at that time was going to be his last contract. I asked Phil at that time if it would be okay to hire his successor and have him work in the basketball department for a year while preparing to succeed Phil at the end of the 97-98 season. Phil readily agreed as long as the person would be unobtrusive. That is, not on the floor during games or during practices and not on the team plane. Despite Phil's okay, we decided not to do that because we did not want to foreclose Phil's return should he change his mind. Of course, should Phil not return and Tim become the head coach, it is still possible that Michael, Scotty, and the others will return. In any event, in one capacity or another, Phil will be with us for at least 5 years. Finally, I want to speak to the reasons why we believe Tim will be an excellent NBA coach. Since Jerry Krause and I arrived at the Chicago Bulls, we have always wanted the Bulls, first and foremost, to be a defensive team. And as you all know, the strength of this team has always been its defense. Tim is widely regarded as one of the best defensive coaches in the country. With respect to offense, we want a coach who believes in movement off the ball and movement of the ball. Someone who believes in the offensive teachings of the great Tex Winter. Tim qualifies here also. He possesses the things that a great coach must have: knowledge, character, and leadership. And he has consistently shown as a coach that his teams can beat teams with greater ability. So the substance of what we have announced today is that we are leaving open the option for Phil, Michael, Scotty, and the others to return and defend their championship, while at the same time we are providing a plan to move forward if they choose not to do so. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce the new basketball director of operations and the next head coach of the Chicago Bulls, Tim Floyd.
Thank you, Jerry. You know, all along, I was led to believe that Jerry Krause was the owner of the team, so this has kind of caught me off guard somewhat. This is a great day for me and my family. At the same time, it's a tough one. I'm leaving a program at Iowa State University that I truly believe in and one that I loved. I'm thrilled and somewhat humbled by the challenge of joining the Chicago Bulls. I'm determined to do everything that I possibly can to try to keep the legacy that lives here alive. Obviously, all the speculation centered around the Floyds coming to Chicago has been flattering, but I've got to admit that over the last 2 months it's become somewhat of a distraction to not only Iowa State University, but to my family. I'd like to thank Beverly and Shannon and Iowa State University for the patience that they've shown with me for the last 2 months. Like most people that have followed the NBA, I've grown to admire the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc, Dennis Rodman. This team has been comprised of some of the greatest players ever. As far as Michael Jordan goes, I think he's absolutely the greatest player to play his position, and as far as I'm concerned, the greatest player to ever play the game. To tell you that I would not like to be a part of this team or its legacy would be ridiculous. I would love to do that. However, in our great game, we have traditions and we have fraternities. I consider myself to be a part of the fraternity. And that fraternity states that you show respect to those that came before you, both that played and both that coached. The fraternity binds players to players, it binds coaches to coaches. I have stated from day one that I would not be interested in this job as long as Phil Jackson had an interest in this job. I don't know Coach Jackson that well, but what I do know about him, I respect. I respect the way his teams play. I've talked to people who do know him. They say he's a fine gentleman, and I know this much. His record is going to stand the test of time in NBA history. He's a terrific coach. I don't know if anybody can fill Coach Jackson's shoes. All I can do is try to achieve to the best of Tim Floyd's abilities and hope that our teams play to their abilities. I have every reason to believe that that will happen because our teams have always done that in the past. Last week, when Michael Jordan made his comments that he would not like to play for anybody other than Phil Jackson, I met with Jerry Krause and Jerry Reinsdorf on Sunday and suggested that my acceptance of this job be contingent upon Michael Jordan's wishes. Mr. Reinsdorf and Mr. Krause both relayed to me that that was consistent with their belief all along, that they wanted to bring the team back. They would like for Phil Jackson to return to the team. I didn't feel like it would be acceptable or appropriate for me to take this job if in any way it would prevent Michael Jordan's return to the Chicago Bulls. Mr. Krause and Mr. Reinsdorf are going to be busy trying to bring this team back. I think it's the right thing to do. I know that I have admired and appreciated the loyalty of the players to Phil Jackson. As a coach, I understand how important that loyalty is. I think it's been a factor in winning the 6 championships. We're in agreement that Michael will get together with Mr. Reinsdorf. If he can get Michael to come back and try to talk Phil Jackson into coming back to join the team. I think that this would be welcomed by the NBA and fans everywhere. I'm not going to do anything to deter that possibility from happening. In the meantime, I'm going to be very busy. I'm going to be busy trying to prepare the Chicago Bulls for the 1998-99 season. If management comes to me and tells me to step aside and move to the front office, I'll try to contribute in some way to what I think could be a 7th World Championship team, and that's if the players and the coach return. If I do return and am asked to coach this basketball team next season, I will be prepared. What should the Chicago Bulls fans expect from Tim Floyd? I want them to expect energy, I want them to expect knowledge, and I want them to expect a love of the game. I also want them to expect a prepared and motivated team. I want them to expect a defensive-oriented basketball team, because I've always believed that championships in any sport are won at the defensive end of the floor. You look at baseball, teams that are great in baseball, they're good up the middle, they got great pitching. They're good behind the plate. The Chicago Bears team that won the championship in 1985 was the most stifling defense that I've ever seen. The Redskins, the Giants, you can talk about the 49ers, you can talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers teams. They still had the great, great defenses. And I really believe that defense is what it's all about. But also, I think you have to have a proper mixture. And to have that proper mixture, you've got to have a great offense. I intend to do the same thing that Phil Jackson did years ago. I want to get together with Tex Winter. I'm going to encourage Tex Winter to return to the Chicago Bulls. I've always felt like he was one of the greatest coaches who has ever coached the game. I think everybody knows what he's about on the offensive end. I've always thought what he knows about the defensive end has been understated because he simply won too many games. I think he can help me also with my knowledge of the league and the players in the league. I know that the lockout should help me be better prepared for next season if it extends itself, because I'll have more time to prepare on the offensive end, and I do want Tex Winter to remain. I don't know Frank Hamlin that well. I don't know Bill Cartwright. I know people that know these men. I know this much. There's not a whole lot broken around here, and I don't think that there's a whole lot that I'm going to need to try to have to fix. I'd like for Bill to return. Based on my conversations with Irvin Johnson, one of my former players, says Bill's a terrific guy. I want to sit down and talk to Bill. I want to sit down and talk to Frank Hamlin. I'm hoping that those two men will remain with the Chicago Bulls. As far as a 4th assistant, I really have had no ideas along that line. I really haven't, not until this press conference. I've looked out here, and I'm seriously considering bringing in James Carville to help me with that last spot. You know, all I can tell our fans is I'm going to do my best. That's all I can do. If I'd have one chance to talk to the players, because the lockout's in place, I'm going to use it right now. I want our players to expect from Tim Floyd honesty, forthrightness, respect, individual attention, direction, and expectations of greatness. I'm going to expect the same things in return. I don't think we're going to have any problem. I think we're going to be on the same page. Because when I watch the Chicago Bulls, I've watched teams that play with energy, that are competitive, and they've always been about winning. Despite what any distraction might be, a little squabble here, a celebration in the locker room, there's been one thing that's been consistent, and that consistency has been about winning championships. There's some members of my immediate family and extended family that I'd like to thank today. My wife, Beverly, and Shannon, thanks for your support and love. I'm not going to change on you. Okay? I'd like to thank my dad. If I could talk to him right now, I'd tell him that I wish he was here. The one thing that he taught me and showed me was that you could have a lot of fun in this great game of coaching, and I've enjoyed it. I can't imagine doing anything else. I'd like to thank Don Haskins, a man that gave me an opportunity at a time when I probably didn't deserve it based on my knowledge or experience of the game. I was 22 years old. He's been more than a mentor. He's been family. And, Coach, I thank you for everything. I'd like to talk to my former players and former coaches. I'd like to thank them. I'd also like to let them know that I hope that we can make them proud of the job that we do here in Chicago. I'd like to thank Jerry Krause for believing in me. I'd like to thank Jerry Reinsdorf. I'd like to thank the 4 athletic directors that gave the Floyds a chance: Jim Bowden at Texas El Paso, Ron Maestri, Gene Smith, and Bill Belknap. And I'd like to say one word to my old friends in the press that I see here today and my new friends. Give me a chance. If you give me a chance, I'm going to give you time, I'm going to give you respect, and I'm going to give you context. But don't call me Jerry Krause's boy, okay? And don't call what Jerry Krause does fishing either, all right? I thought I'd open it up to questions. If you have any questions for me, please feel free. Or Tim, could you come up here and help us?
We have a lot of people in the room. We want to make sure everybody gets to hear the question. We'd like to do it in an orderly fashion, at least in the beginning. So I'll identify you. You can ask your question. Then I want to repeat it so everybody can hear it. Go ahead, Peggy.
Tim, it sounds very noble, the whole plan. You would be in the wings with Phil Jackson if Phil Jackson were to come back. But if you put yourself in his shoes and you were at Iowa State, the administration had your successor waiting in the wings, how realistic is it that you could have a regular working relationship?
Go ahead.
Okay. If they had my successor waiting in the wings at Iowa State, I'll tell you what I would do. I would step completely away if that's what Phil wanted, and I mean that. Phil wanted to come back and coach this basketball team, I'll step completely away. I know this much. I was not about to take this job if I thought that it would prevent in any way Michael Jordan's return to the game. And what I've tried to do is make sure that he will feel comfortable with this. This is all about Michael's wishes. And if Phil Jackson wants to return, I will step away.
Corey? Tim, you've been a coach for 22 years on the floor. Have you really thought clearly about the idea if Phil does come back, stepping aside completely from the day-to-day hands-on operation of a basketball team, how you're going to deal with it? What if he stays more than a year? What if it's 2 years? What if it's 3 years?
I'll just have to accept that. I know this. This was too great an opportunity. It's too great a challenge. It's the greatest challenge in coaching today. I can't imagine anybody stepping into a more difficult situation. That's what I've been about. And I've always wanted to coach in the NBA. I've always wanted an opportunity to coach the best players, to coach against the best players, and to coach against the best coaches. So if I have to wait my turn, I will.
Yes, I'd like to know either from you, Tim, or either from Jerry's, who will comprise the emissaries who will be dispatched to extend the invitation to Phil again to come back since he already, or if you've already talked to him, haven't you?
Well, I think you people will be the initial emissaries. There's no rush. We'll make contact with Phil and make sure that he understands. You know, I asked Phil 5 or 6 times over the course of the last year if he wanted to change his mind and coach, and he always said that he didn't. But perhaps now that he's been away and he's had a chance to meditate, perhaps he will change his mind. So as soon as we find out where he is, we'll certainly communicate with him.
Jerry, could you address the whole, despite your denials over the last couple of years, there still is this widespread belief that what you did to Phil Jackson amounted to a constructive dismissal, that you weren't serious and you were playing somehow a double talk game. Can you just run through what you did, and was it a constructive dismissal?
No, I think Phil Jackson has publicly acknowledged that what I've said before is correct. Phil and I sat down I guess it was about 2 years ago, at the first game of the Orlando series, and that would have been, I guess, in the 95, 96 championship, the series that we swept Orlando. And I asked Phil if he'd like to come back for 5 years, and he said he did not. He did want to come back. He thought maybe for 1 year, possibly 2 years. We agreed that day that we had an agreement that he was going to come back next year, and we'd sit down right after the playoffs and work something out. 3 days after we won that 96 championship, we sat down. We started talking about 2 years. Phil, in the course of the discussion, said his real preference was a 1-year contract. So we signed a 1-year contract to cover the whatever season that was, the next year, I guess the 97, 98 season. So he coached for 1 more year. We then met again in Salt Lake City during the first time we played the Jazz. And I asked Phil, what about next year? He said he didn't know if he wanted to coach next year. He didn't know if he ever wanted to walk in a gym next year or ever again. But let's talk about it when the season's over. We won that championship. Phil and I met in Montana last August. He said he told me this was positively the last year that he wanted to coach. And we agreed to a 1-year contract. And as I said, I even suggested to him that maybe it would be smart for us to hire his successor at that time and let him observe, let him learn the workings of the Bulls, et cetera, et cetera. And Phil thought that was a fine idea. But as I said earlier, we didn't do it because I thought Phil might change his mind. Now, that gets us to the 97-98 season when the stories started to float about Phil Jackson being pushed out. Virtually every time there was a story of that nature, I would either call Phil or see Phil and say, Phil, have you changed your mind? And Phil always told me, no, he hasn't changed his mind. He's not going to coach. He's not going to coach next year. I took one final shot on the Wednesday after the playoffs. We had our what seems to be almost annual celebratory dinner of our staff, our front office. Phil and I chatted for a few minutes. I said, Phil, I just want you to know one last time, if you want to come back, we want you to come back. And Phil looked at me and he said, no, I have to step aside. Now, I can't repeat this, any more than I've repeated it. And people who have asked Phil Jackson whether this is the truth have gotten the answer back from Phil that it is the truth. So if I say it and Phil says it, what else can we say? What are the possibilities that Phil would come back? I have no idea. Every time I've asked him to come back, he said he doesn't want to come back. But we're going to try one more time. And maybe Michael can talk him into it.
You're known as a great recruiter. Obviously, recruiting Michael Jordan would be the biggest recruiting pass you've ever had to face. What can you tell Michael? What can you say that you can do to come back? And how are you going to approach it the first time?
I'll say this. Since I haven't spoken with Michael, I don't feel real comfortable in saying what I would say to Michael, but I would say this, that my interest is trying to play for a 7th World Championship. I would start it right there, and that I'm really not interested in changing a whole lot about what's taken place here, because this has been pretty special. In terms to me as a coach, the style of play, I've admired it. I'd love to have run the triple post at Iowa State, but I never felt like I had the personnel to do it. I came over here and studied it 5, 6 years ago. But I'm not interested in changing a whole lot.
How can you approach him initially? I mean, obviously, your hands are tied now with the lockout.
With the lockout, my hands are tied.
Tim, possibility of Buzz Peterson with a...
Well, you've heard what happened out here this afternoon. Phil Jackson's name has cropped up again as a potential head coach of the Bulls in 98, 99. As of this moment, Tim Floyd is the new director of basketball operations. And what we have here basically is a high-stakes tennis match. The two Jerrys on one side and a doubles match against Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson. And I have to tell you right now, I think the two Jerrys have just served up a Pete Sampras-style serve. And at this moment, it might be their advantage because all the emphasis and all the pressure now goes to Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson. That's the story for now from the United Center. We'll be back with much more on the Midday News. This is Dan Roan reporting live. Now back to the studio and Bill and Larry.
Yeah, we'll forgive the mixed sports metaphor, Dan. I think you summed it up perfectly. How do you think Floyd came across in his first face-off with the media here?
As perfectly as possible. And this continues, and we'll see what happens the rest of the day here, Bill. But I don't think there's any question that he said exactly the right things to the people here. And I think he has been everything to this point, you know, a short 30 minutes or so, but everything that the two Jerrys would want him to be.
We did contact Todd Musburger, at least his office. According to his assistants, he's in a meeting, not even watching the press conference. That's Phil Jackson's agent, and is not aware of the offer that is now right on the table in front of him. So we'll hear more. Thank you very much, Dan Roan.
Okay, guys.
More from Dan tonight.
Right. So it is official. Director of Basketball Operations, the new title for Tim Floyd. Stay with us for more live coverage at WGN News at noon. For Bill Weir, I'm Larry Potash. Thank you for joining us. We now join our regularly scheduled program.
This has been a WGN News special report. We now resume regular programming.